100 years ago, this silent Appalachian forest was not silent at all. It roared with steam engines, falling giants of wood, and the desperate hope of men who believed the trees would never end. But they were wrong. In the winter of 1911, when the mountains of Appalachia were still thick with virgin timber and coal smoke had just begun to stain the sky above the valleys, a small logging settlement known locally as Red Ash Camp stood along a narrow-gauge railroad spur in eastern Kentucky. The camp did not appear on most maps. It belonged to a timber company headquartered in Louisville, and like many such operations in the early 20th century, it existed for one purpose only: to cut, load, and ship as much hardwood as possible before the forest ran out. The men who lived there came from many places. Some were local farmers whose crops had failed after seasons of poor soil and flood. Others were immigrants from Italy and Hungary who had first tried their luck in northern steel mills before drifting south in search of steadier pay. A few were boys barely 17, lying about their age to earn $1 a day swinging an axe or tending a steam skidder. They lived in rough-hewn bunkhouses built from the very trees they felled, their roofs tarred with pitch, their floors uneven and drafty. In winter, the wind cut through the cracks in the walls and froze water in tin cups beside their beds. The company store stood at the center of the camp. It sold flour, salt pork, beans, lamp oil, and heavy wool coats at prices set by the company itself. Wages were often paid in scrip, thin metal tokens stamped with the company's name, redeemable only at that store. A man could work 12 hours a day, 6 days a week, and still find himself owing money by the month's end. Yet for many, it was better than nothing. The timber boom promised steady work, and rumors spread that the forests of the southern Appalachians were so vast they would last forever. Among the men was Thomas Hale, a 30-year-old father of two from a small farm near Hazard. When blight destroyed his corn and a late frost killed what little tobacco he had planted, he boarded a wagon headed for Red Ash Camp. He told his wife, Mary, it would only be for one season. He would earn enough to buy seed, maybe even a mule. Then he would come home for good. Like many promises made in hard times, it was spoken with hope but little certainty. The work began before sunrise. A whistle from the mill shrieked through the hollow, echoing off the ridges. Men stumbled from their bunks, pulled on stiff boots, and gathered their tools. In the early years of Appalachian logging, much of the cutting was still done by hand. Two men would stand on opposite sides of a giant chestnut or poplar, gripping a crosscut saw nearly 6 feet long. They moved in rhythm, back and forth, teeth biting deep into living wood that had stood for more than a century. When the trunk finally cracked and began to lean, someone shouted a warning. The tree fell with a thunderous crash that shook the ground and sent birds scattering into the grey sky. Later, steam-powered skidders were brought in, massive machines that dragged logs from the slopes using thick cables. They made the work faster and more profitable, but also more dangerous. Cables snapped without warning. Logs rolled unpredictably down muddy inclines. In 1912 alone, according to state records from Kentucky and West Virginia, dozens of loggers were killed in accidents across the region. Many deaths were never formally recorded. In isolated camps like Red Ash, a man could be buried on a hillside with only a wooden marker and a brief note sent to his family. Thomas learned quickly that the forest was unforgiving. One morning in late March, as snowmelt turned the slopes slick with mud, a fellow worker named Carlo slipped while guiding a log toward the rail line. The log shifted, pinned him against a stump, and crushed his chest before anyone could react. The camp doctor, an older man who had once practiced in a town 2 counties over, arrived too late. Carlo died before noon. That evening, the men gathered outside the bunkhouse. No preacher was available, so the foreman said a few words. They buried Carlo at the edge of the clearing, overlooking the valley. By dawn, the whistle blew again, and the saws resumed their song. Despite the danger, the logging industry transformed the mountains. Rail lines cut through valleys that had once been reachable only by foot or mule. Small settlements sprang up almost overnight. Sawmills ran day and night, their blades screaming as they sliced trunks into boards destined for cities far beyond the mountains. The hardwood from Appalachia built homes in Ohio, furniture in Chicago, and railroad ties that stretched toward the west. Investors grew wealthy. Local workers earned enough to survive, but rarely enough to escape the cycle of labor and debt. By 1915, Red Ash Camp had doubled in size. Families began to arrive, and small cabins were built for wives and children. A one-room schoolhouse opened near the creek. On Sundays, if the weather allowed, a traveling preacher visited to deliver sermons beneath a stand of oaks not yet marked for cutting. There were moments of joy, fiddles played in the evenings, children chasing each other between stacks of lumber, women trading recipes and stories of home. Yet the constant backdrop was the steady disappearance of the forest. Old-timers in the region had once believed the mountains were eternal and untouchable. But within a decade, hillsides that had been dark with timber were stripped bare. Without tree roots to hold the soil, heavy rains triggered landslides and floods. Streams ran brown with sediment. Fish populations dwindled. Some farmers in neighboring hollows complained that their wells had begun to dry up after nearby slopes were cleared. Early conservationists, including foresters working with the federal government, warned that unchecked logging would leave the land scarred for generations. Their voices were often drowned out by the profits rolling in. Thomas began to notice the change. Where he had once walked under a canopy so thick it dimmed the afternoon sun, he now saw open sky. The calls of certain birds grew rare. Summers felt hotter without the shade. He wrote letters to Mary describing the work but left out the worst parts. He sent money whenever he could, though the deductions for tools, food, and lodging often left less than he expected. In the winter of 1917, as the United States entered World War I, demand for timber surged again. Wood was needed for trenches, railways, ships, and military camps. Production intensified. The company extended rail lines deeper into the mountains, chasing the last stands of old-growth trees. Accidents increased as crews worked longer hours under pressure to meet quotas. One icy morning, a cable on a skidder snapped and whipped through the air with lethal force. It struck the foreman, killing him instantly. The men stood in stunned silence. Even those who had resented his strict discipline felt the weight of how fragile their lives were. By 1920, much of the accessible timber around Red Ash Camp had been harvested. The once bustling settlement began to shrink. Some families left in search of coal mining jobs, which were expanding rapidly across eastern Kentucky and southern West Virginia. Others moved north to industrial cities. The company, having extracted what it could, started dismantling parts of the mill. Buildings were sold or abandoned. The narrow-gauge tracks, once crowded with loaded railcars, saw fewer and fewer shipments. Thomas had spent nearly 9 years in the camp. His hair had grayed at the temples. His hands were scarred and calloused beyond feeling. He had earned enough to pay off debts on the farm, but the land he planned to return to was no longer the same. Flooding, worsened by deforestation upstream, had eroded part of his fields. When he finally went home for good in 1921, he found Mary stronger than he remembered and his children nearly grown. The mule he had once hoped to buy was there, along with new challenges he could not yet see. Red Ash Camp faded into memory. By the late 1920s, little remained but stone foundations and a few rusted pieces of machinery half buried in weeds. Saplings began to reclaim the clearings. Over decades, second-growth forests rose where giants once stood. Hikers who pass through parts of Appalachia today sometimes stumble upon old cemeteries marked by weathered wooden crosses or uncarved stones. Many belong to loggers whose names never appeared in newspapers. Historians now estimate that by the early 20th century, the majority of the original old-growth forest in the southern Appalachians had been cut. The industry brought roads, railroads, and economic opportunity, but it also left deep environmental scars. In response, national forests were established, and conservation laws slowly took shape. The mountains, resilient as ever, began a long process of healing. The story of camps like Red Ash is not one of legend or ghosts, but of real men and families who lived at the edge of survival and progress. They woke before dawn, faced daily danger, and helped build a nation's infrastructure with their labor. They endured debt, injury, isolation, and loss. Their lives were neither romantic nor widely recorded, yet they shaped the history of Appalachia in lasting ways. On quiet mornings in those mountains, when fog drifts low through the hollows and the forest stands thick once more, it is hard to imagine the roar of saws and the crash of falling timber that once echoed there. But beneath the soil lie remnants of rail lines and rusted tools, silent evidence of a time when entire communities rose and vanished with the trees. The mountains remain, altered yet enduring, holding the memory of those who worked, struggled, and sometimes died in the shadow of their vast and changing forests. By the time Thomas Hale returned to his farm for good, the mountains were already entering a different chapter of their history. Across Appalachia, the timber rush that had defined the early 1900s was slowing, not because the companies had grown cautious, but because there was simply less left to cut. In some counties of eastern Kentucky and West Virginia, more than 3/4 of the original old-growth forest had been harvested within a single generation. What had once seemed endless was revealed to be painfully finite. Thomas tried to settle back into farming, but the land bore the marks of what had happened upstream. Without dense tree cover to slow rainfall, storms hit harder. Creeks rose quickly, flooding low fields and carrying away topsoil that had taken centuries to form. In the spring of 1922, a heavy rain washed out part of his cornfield, leaving behind a layer of gravel and debris. Neighbors spoke openly about how the logging had changed everything. Older men remembered when streams ran clear even after a storm and when chestnut trees towered over the ridges. Now many slopes were patchworks of stumps and young saplings struggling to take root. Despite the damage, the region was not silent. Coal mining expanded rapidly during the 1920s, drawing former loggers into underground work. Some of the same narrow-gauge rail lines that once hauled logs were repurposed to carry coal. A few of Thomas's former campmates wrote letters describing life in the mines: long hours in darkness, the constant threat of cave-ins, explosions, and black lung disease. The dangers were different, but the pattern was familiar: hard labor, company control, and communities built around a single industry. Thomas was tempted more than once to leave farming behind and join them. Money was still tight, and market prices for crops fluctuated wildly. But he had spent nearly a decade in the woods under the authority of a company that decided when he worked, where he lived, and what he owed. He chose instead to endure the uncertainty of farming rather than return to another camp town. In 1929, when the Great Depression began after the stock market crash, Appalachia felt the blow deeply. Timber companies that had lingered in the region closed entirely. Coal demand dropped. Banks failed. Many families who had depended on wages from industrial work found themselves with nothing. In rural counties, survival often meant relying on gardens, livestock, hunting, and tight-knit communities. The second-growth forests that had begun to rise after the logging boom became sources of firewood and game. Nature, slowly recovering, once again played a direct role in keeping people alive. During the 1930s, a new presence appeared in the mountains: the federal government. Through programs like the Civilian Conservation Corps, young men were hired to plant trees, build fire towers, construct trails, and fight erosion. Some of the very hillsides that had been stripped bare during the logging era were replanted under these programs. In parts of Kentucky, Tennessee, and North Carolina, large tracts of cut-over land were purchased and incorporated into national forests. Conservation, once dismissed as an obstacle to profit, became policy. Thomas, now in his 50s, watched as crews of younger men planted seedlings in areas he remembered as raw stumps and mud. He sometimes told them what the forest had looked like before. They listened with curiosity, as if he were describing another world. To them, the second-growth wood seemed natural and permanent. Few could imagine trees so wide that 3 men could not wrap their arms around them. Health problems began to trouble Thomas in his later years. Though he had avoided the coal mines, years of breathing sawdust and wood smoke had left their mark. Winter coughs lingered longer than they once had. His hands, damaged by cold mornings gripping metal tools, ached constantly. Still, he considered himself fortunate compared to many he had known. He had survived accidents that claimed others. He had returned home. His children grew into adulthood, one becoming a schoolteacher and another working for the railroad. As decades passed, memories of Red Ash Camp faded into stories told on porches at dusk. The exact location of the bunkhouses became harder to pinpoint. Nature did what it always does: it reclaimed. By the 1950s, thick stands of oak, hickory, and young poplar covered much of the former logging site. Rusted boiler parts and fragments of rail occasionally surfaced after heavy rains, reminders of a brief but intense chapter of industrial activity. Environmental historians studying the region later described the early 20th century logging era as one of the most transformative periods in Appalachian history. Entire ecosystems were altered. Wildlife habitats shifted. Soil composition changed. Yet they also noted the resilience of the land. The southern Appalachian region today contains some of the most biologically diverse temperate forests in the world, much of its second or third growth that emerged after the clearcutting era. What appears ancient in many places is, in fact, the result of regrowth over the past 100 years. Thomas lived long enough to see parts of that recovery. In the late 1950s, he walked with his grandson along a ridge that had once been part of the logging tract. The boy ran ahead through trees tall enough to block the sun, unaware that they were standing on what had once been a scarred hillside. Thomas paused and listened. The wind moving through leaves sounded similar to what he remembered from his earliest days in the mountains. Different trees, different generation, but the same steady whisper. He told his grandson about the men he had worked beside, Carlo, who never returned home, the foreman killed by a snapping cable, the dozens of unnamed workers who had come seeking wages and left only memories. He spoke not with bitterness, but with a quiet understanding of how necessity shapes choices. "We did what we had to," he said. "We didn't think the trees would ever end." When Thomas died in the early 1960s, he was buried in a small cemetery near his farm. No newspaper beyond the local weekly mentioned his passing. Yet his life reflected the experience of thousands of Appalachian workers whose labor fueled America's expansion. The boards that frame houses in distant cities, the railroad ties that connected states, and the infrastructure that supported a growing nation all carried traces of their effort. Today, hikers, researchers, and local historians occasionally uncover records of forgotten logging camps like Red Ash. Old payroll books, company script tokens, faded photographs of men posing beside enormous tree stumps. These artifacts tell a story grounded not in myth, but in documented history. They reveal how quickly landscapes can change under economic pressure and how slowly they recover. The Appalachian Mountains remain, older than any industry that has passed through them. They have witnessed logging booms, coal rushes, economic collapse, and environmental reform. Beneath the layers of soil and forest growth lie the physical remnants of camps, mills, and rail lines. Above them rises a forest that, while no longer the untouched wilderness it once was, stands as proof of renewal. The story of Red Ash Camp is only one among many, but it reflects a broader truth. The timber boom brought wages and development, but it also carried risk, loss, and lasting environmental impact. It reshaped communities and altered the land in ways still visible a century later. The men who swung the saws were not legends or ghosts. They were fathers, sons, immigrants, and farmers, real people navigating the difficult balance between survival and consequence. In the quiet of the present-day forest, where sunlight filters through leaves that did not exist 100 years ago, there is no sound of saw blades or steam engines. Yet if one stands still long enough, it is possible to sense the weight of what occurred there, the labor, the ambition, the mistakes, and the endurance. The mountains keep that history without speaking it aloud, holding within their ridges the memory of a time when the trees fell in thunder and entire communities rose and disappeared with them. In the years after Thomas was laid to rest, the mountains continued their slow transformation. Roads improved, small towns grew, and electricity reached hollows that had once relied on kerosene lamps. What had once been isolated logging territory gradually connected to the wider world. Yet beneath modernization, the layered history of extraction remained part of everyday life. During the 1970s, researchers from regional universities began documenting the environmental effects of early industrial logging across Appalachia. Old photographs taken between 1890 and 1925 revealed hillsides almost completely bare, with nothing left but brush and charred stumps. Comparing those images to the thick green forests of the present surprised many people who assumed the mountains had always looked the way they did now. Studies showed how aggressive clearcutting, followed by fire and erosion, had permanently altered soil composition in some areas. Certain tree species, once dominant, never fully returned in the same numbers. The American chestnut, which had made up a significant portion of Appalachian forests during Thomas's youth, had already been devastated by blight in the early 20th century. Combined with heavy logging, its near disappearance changed forest structure dramatically. Older residents remembered chestnuts not only as timber, but as a reliable food source for livestock and wildlife. By the mid-century, they were mostly gone, their loss marking another irreversible shift. Local communities carried their own memories. In small county museums, exhibits displayed crosscut saws, logging hooks, black and white photographs of men standing on massive logs, and faded pay records showing daily wages of $1 or $2. Oral histories collected from descendants of loggers described the constant noise of the mills, the smell of fresh-cut wood, and the ever-present understanding that injury could happen at any moment. Some descendants felt pride in their ancestors' endurance and skill. Logging required strength, coordination, and trust between workers. A poorly timed movement with a crosscut saw could injure a partner. Felling a massive tree demanded careful calculation of angles and wind direction. These were not careless men. They were laborious, operating with limited technology in dangerous conditions, doing work that shaped the country's infrastructure. Others viewed the era more critically. They pointed to exploitative labor practices, debt cycles created by company stores, and the environmental damage left behind when corporations moved on. By the late 20th century, discussions about sustainable forestry gained traction. Regulations were strengthened. Clear-cutting practices became more controlled in many areas, though debates over land use never fully disappeared. Meanwhile, the forests continued to mature. Second-growth stands reached heights that, to a casual observer, felt ancient. Wildlife populations, including deer and wild turkey, rebounded in many parts of the region. Black bears, once pushed deeper into remote areas, gradually expanded their range. Streams once choked with sediment cleared in places where reforestation stabilized the soil. Occasionally, heavy rains still exposed fragments of the past. Rusted rails surfaced from beneath leaf litter. Old boiler tanks lay hidden in thickets. In some remote hollows, rectangular depressions in the earth marked where bunkhouses had stood. Time had erased most obvious signs of reddish camp, but careful eyes could still read the land like a record. In the early 2000s, a local history teacher assigned her students a project: locate and document remnants of early industrial sites in their county. Among the students was Thomas Hale's great-granddaughter, Emily. She had grown up hearing stories passed down through generations, stories of logging camps, of hardship, of men who worked among falling giants of wood. Curious to connect family memory with physical evidence, she began researching property records and old rail maps. With permission from a current landowner, Emily hiked into a wooded tract believed to be near the old Red Ash campsite. The forest was dense, filled with tulip poplar, oak, and maple. After several hours of searching, she found a low line of stones arranged in a rough rectangle. Nearby, half buried in soil, lay a corroded metal object shaped like part of a pulley wheel. It was small compared to the scale of the forest around it, but it represented something significant, proof that the stories were real. Emily later presented her findings to the class, explaining how the logging boom had both supported and strained Appalachian communities. She described how her great-grandfather had intended to work only one season but stayed nearly a decade. She showed historical data about deforestation rates in the early 1900s and photographs of the region taken before and after industrial cutting. Her project highlighted a simple truth: history is rarely purely heroic or purely tragic. It is complex, shaped by necessity, ambition, and consequence. In recent years, ecologists studying Appalachian forests have emphasized their resilience. While old-growth ecosystems are nearly impossible to replicate fully once lost, second-growth forests can still support remarkable biodiversity. Conservation organizations continue efforts to protect remaining mature stands and restore degraded land. Research into blight-resistant American chestnut trees offers hope that one day the species might return in meaningful numbers. Tourism has also become part of the region's economy. Visitors hike, camp, and photograph landscapes that were once stripped nearly bare. Interpretive signs along some trails explain the history of logging and mining, ensuring that the past is not forgotten. The narrative has shifted from unchecked extraction to stewardship and balance. Yet the deeper story remains personal. It lives in family records, in inherited tools kept in barns, in surnames carved into cemetery stones. The men of camps like Red Ash were not widely memorialized, but their labor was foundational. They were part of a broader American story of industrial growth, one that brought opportunity while leaving difficult lessons behind. If one stands today on a ridge overlooking an Appalachian valley at dawn, the scene appears timeless. Layered mountains fading blue into the distance, fog pooling in low places, forests stretching unbroken to the horizon. It is easy to believe it has always been this way. But beneath that calm view lies a century of change. Trees that seem old may only be 80 or 90 years grown. Soil that feels stable once slid downhill in torrents after heavy rain. Quiet hollows once rang with whistles and the crash of timber. The continuation of this story is not about disappearance, but about endurance. The mountains endured industry. Communities endured economic collapse and reinvention. Forests endured axes and fire and returned in new forms. Each generation inherits both the benefits and the burdens of what came before. Red Ash Camp no longer exists as a functioning place, but it exists in record books, in recovered artifacts, and in the bloodlines of families who remain in the region. Its story mirrors hundreds of similar camps scattered across Appalachia in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Together, they represent a defining era when natural abundance met industrial demand, and ordinary people stood at the center of that collision. The wind that moves through today's trees is not the same wind Thomas heard in 1911, yet it travels across the same ridges. The land remembers in subtle ways, through altered slopes, through regrown forests, through the quiet persistence of life returning after disruption. History there is not sealed in textbooks. It is embedded in the ground itself. As the 21st century moved forward, conversations about the past grew more urgent. Climate scientists, historians, and local leaders began speaking together about land use, sustainability, and responsibility. In Appalachia, where the land had already endured waves of logging, mining, and industrial development, these discussions carried particular weight. The mountains were no longer viewed only as sources of timber or coal, but as living systems that required balance. Emily Hale, inspired by her school project years earlier, went on to study environmental science at a university in Kentucky. While researching forest regeneration, she learned that many of the hardwood stands now considered mature had grown after the intense logging period between 1890 and 1920. Treeing studies showed accelerated growth patterns in second-growth forests, confirming that vast areas had once been clear-cut. In academic journals, she found references to camps similar to red ash scattered across the Cumberland Plateau and the Blue Ridge. Many had operated for only a decade before vanishing. Her research took her back to the land her great-grandfather once walked. With modern mapping tools and historical rail surveys, she identified the likely route of the narrow-gauge line that had served the camp. On satellite images, faint linear clearings hinted at its path. Hiking along that corridor, she found clusters of younger trees aligned in unusually straight rows, evidence of how the land had been reshaped by tracks and machinery. The forest had grown back, but it followed patterns set by human intervention a century earlier. During one visit, she met an elderly man named Robert Lawson whose grandfather had also worked in logging camps in eastern Kentucky. Robert carried with him a small tin token stamped with the name of a long-defunct timber company. It had been used as payment at a company store, just like the script once circulated in Red Ash Camp. He described stories passed down through his family. Men paid in metal instead of cash, prices inflated beyond fairness, debts that tied workers to their jobs. He also spoke of camaraderie, of shared meals and music in the evenings after exhausting shifts. These overlapping memories formed a fuller picture of the era. It was neither purely exploitative nor purely noble. It was a time shaped by limited choices. Industrialization moved quickly, and rural communities often had little leverage against corporations that controlled land and capital. Yet workers built support networks among themselves. When someone was injured, neighbors gathered food for the family. When tragedy struck, entire camps attended funerals, even if they had to return to work the next morning. In recent decades, efforts to preserve Appalachian cultural history have expanded. Regional archives collect oral testimonies from descendants of loggers and miners. Museums display restored steam logging equipment. Educational programs teach students about both the economic benefits and environmental costs of early industrial expansion. The goal is not to erase the past, but to understand it clearly. Meanwhile, the forests continue to evolve. Ecologists note that today's Appalachian woodlands differ from the pre-industrial forests in species composition and density. Some wildlife adapted well to second growth conditions, while others declined. Conservation strategies now focus on maintaining biodiversity, preventing invasive species, and reducing wildfire risks that increase with changing climate patterns. Lessons learned from the early logging era inform current forestry practices, including selective harvesting and longer rotation cycles. On a cool autumn morning, Emily stood once more on the ridge overlooking the valley that had once echoed with saws and steam whistles. The air smelled of fallen leaves and damp earth. Sunlight filtered through a canopy of oak and maple that had grown tall over the last century. Somewhere in the distance, a woodpecker tapped against bark. The scene felt peaceful, almost untouched. She tried to imagine the same hillside in 1912, mud exposed, stumps scattered, smoke drifting from the mill. She pictured her great-grandfather gripping a crosscut saw, muscles straining, unaware of how profoundly that work would shape the land and his descendants' understanding of it. The contrast was striking. Where there had once been urgency and extraction, there was now reflection and renewal. History in Appalachia does not sit neatly in the past. It shapes identity. Many families still trace their roots to logging camps, coal towns, and railroad crews. Pride in hard work remains strong, even as economic models change. Tourism, education, healthcare, and small businesses now play larger roles in local economies. Yet reminders of industrial beginnings remain embedded in place names, abandoned rail grades, and family stories. As the sun rose higher, Emily placed her hand against the trunk of a mature poplar. Its bark was rough and cool beneath her palm. She thought about growth, not just of trees, but of understanding. A century earlier, few people questioned whether the forests would endure. Today, Questions of sustainability are central to public discussion. The mistakes of the past are studied so they are not repeated in the same way. The mountains, older than any generation that inhabits them, stand as witnesses. They have endured transformation after transformation. Forests fall and rise again. Industries boom and decline. Families leave and return. What remains constant is the land's quiet persistence. Red Ash Camp is gone, but its story continues in every ring of the trees that grew after it. It lives in the archives that record payrolls and accident reports. It survives in the descendants who walk the same ridges with new awareness. The thunder of falling timber has faded, replaced by wind through leaves that once were saplings pushing up through scarred earth. And so the narrative stretches forward, not as a tale of ghosts or forgotten mystery, but as a living history of resilience. The Appalachian Mountains carry within them the memory of labor, loss, ambition, and renewal. They remind each generation that prosperity without foresight has consequences, and that healing, though slow, is possible. In the stillness of the present forest, where green hills roll endlessly toward the horizon, it is difficult to hear echoes of axes or steam engines. Yet the silence itself speaks. It tells of what was taken, what endured, and what grew back stronger. The story does not end with abandonment or ruin. It continues in growth, in remembrance, and in the steady rise of trees reclaiming the sky. Years passed, and the conversation around the Appalachian forests widened beyond the region itself. Scholars from across the country began referencing the early 20th century logging boom as a case study in how quickly natural abundance can be misjudged. Economic historians pointed out that at the height of production, timber companies genuinely believed the hardwood supply would last indefinitely. Reports from that era often described the mountains as inexhaustible. Within a few decades, reality proved otherwise. In small Appalachian towns, the legacy of that overconfidence was visible not only in the landscape but also in demographic change. When the timber left, many jobs left with it. Some communities never fully recovered their populations. Census records from the 1930s and 1940s show declines in several rural counties that had once supported bustling camps and mills. Younger generations migrated towards cities, seeking stability that extractive industries had failed to provide long-term. Yet the story was not solely one of departure. Those who remained adapted. Farming practices shifted. Some families diversified into livestock rather than relying solely on crops vulnerable to flooding. Others entered trades, carpentry, mechanics, teaching, less dependent on a single resource. Over time, Appalachian identity evolved beyond the narrow lens of timber and coal. In the late 20th century, environmental awareness deepened. Flood control projects, soil conservation programs, and watershed management initiatives became common. In areas that had suffered severe erosion after early clearcutting, terracing and replanting helped stabilize hillsides. Scientists documented how forest cover, once reduced dramatically, had returned to levels comparable to or even exceeding those of the early 1900s, though composed largely of younger trees. At the same time, climate patterns began shifting in noticeable ways. Heavier rainfall events tested the resilience of regrown forests. Ecologists studied whether second-growth stands were as effective at preventing erosion as the old-growth forests they replaced. The answer was complex. Mature second-growth forests provided significant protection, but soil depth and species diversity still reflected the disturbances of the past. For descendants like Emily, the connection between family history and environmental science felt personal. She often reflected on how her great-grandfather's generation could not have foreseen the long-term consequences of rapid industrial logging. They were responding to immediate needs: food, shelter, debt. Broader ecological systems were not part of their daily calculations. Today, with satellite data and long-term studies available, society possessed knowledge that earlier generations did not. With that knowledge came responsibility. During a regional conference on Appalachian land use, Emily presented research linking historical logging maps with present-day forest density patterns. Her findings showed how rail access had determined the most heavily cut areas. Places farther from tracks often retained pockets of older trees. These surviving stands became critical seed sources for regrowth. Her work illustrated how even the structure of the modern forest carried the imprint of past industry. After her presentation, an elderly attendee approached her. He introduced himself as the grandson of a sawmill engineer who had worked in a camp not far from Red Ash. He thanked her for acknowledging both the hardship and the contribution of those workers. "My grandfather was proud of what he built," the man said quietly. but he also knew the hills wouldn't look the same. That dual awareness, pride and caution, came to define how many in the region viewed their heritage. The logging era was neither erased nor glorified. It was remembered as a turning point. Back in the mountains, seasons continued their steady cycle. Spring brought bright green leaves and wildflowers blooming along old railbeds now converted into hiking trails. Summer filled the valleys with cicada song. Autumn painted the hillsides in red and gold. Winter stripped the trees bare, revealing the contours of slopes once carved by skidders and mule teams. On one winter walk, Emily followed a shallow depression that marked where the main track of Reddish Camp had once run. Snow covered the ground, softening the terrain. She paused where the bunkhouse foundations had likely stood. The forest around her was quiet, interrupted only by wind brushing through branches. It struck her how completely nature had reclaimed what industry left behind. Without maps or research, a passerby might never know a settlement had existed there. She imagined the morning whistle that once echoed through the hollow, the shuffle of boots on frozen earth, the clatter of tools. She pictured men lining up at the company store, metal script clinking in their hands. She thought of accidents recorded only in fading ledgers, of families waiting for letters, of children who grew up in cabins beside towering logs stacked for shipment. Then she looked at the trees rising around her, straight, tall, rooted firmly in soil that had once been churned into mud. Growth had not erased the past, but it had softened its sharpest edges. The land had absorbed the disturbance and moved forward. In many ways, the broader American story followed a similar pattern. Rapid industrial expansion fueled national growth, often without full consideration of environmental cost. Over time, regulation and conservation emerged in response to visible damage. Lessons were learned, sometimes slowly, sometimes painfully. Appalachia's forests became part of that national lesson. Today, school children in the region study both the boom years and the recovery. They learn about sustainable forestry practices, selective cutting, long-term planning, habitat preservation. They visit state parks and national forests that owe their existence, in part, to recognition that earlier exploitation went too far. The mountains serve not only as a backdrop for history, but as a classroom. As dusk settled over the ridge, Emily took one last look at the valley below. Mist gathered between layers of hills, just as it had a century earlier. The difference was not in the shape of the land, but in understanding. Where once the forest had been seen primarily as timber waiting to be harvested, it was now recognized as a complex ecosystem supporting water, wildlife, climate balance, and community identity. The continuation of the Red Ash story was not marked by dramatic endings or rediscovered treasure. It unfolded quietly, in research papers, in preserved artifacts, in reforested slopes, in conversations between generations. It lived in the awareness that prosperity must be balanced with foresight. Long after the last saw at Red Ash fell silent, the mountains continued to stand. Trees grew where giants once fell. Families remembered. Scholars studied. Trails replaced tracks. The land endured, carrying within its rings and roots the memory of axes, steam, ambition, and resilience. And in that endurance lies the final truth of the story. Industries rise and fade, camps appear and vanish, but the relationship between people and the land remains ongoing. Each generation inherits both the benefits and the consequences of what came before. In Appalachia, as in many places shaped by resource booms, the forest's return is both a gift and a reminder, proof that recovery is possible, and that stewardship must walk beside progress if the mountains are to remain strong for those yet to come. In the decades that followed, technology advanced faster than anyone in Thomas Hale's time could have imagined. Satellites mapped forest cover from space. Digital archives preserved payroll records that once gathered dust in courthouse basements. What had been isolated knowledge, kept in family memory or scattered documents, became part of a broader understanding of how landscapes change under pressure. Researchers analyzing satellite imagery in the early 2000s confirmed something remarkable. Much of Appalachia, once heavily logged, had become one of the most forested regions in the eastern United States again. This regrowth, however, was not identical to what had stood before 1900. The original old-growth ecosystem, complex, layered, and centuries old, had largely vanished. In its place stood younger, more uniform stands. The forest had returned, but history had altered its composition. Economists studying rural development pointed out another long-term effect of the timber boom. The infrastructure built to support logging, rail corridors, graded roads, river access points, later shaped where towns developed and where highways were constructed. Even after the mills disappeared, the pathways carved for industry influenced settlement patterns. Modern communities unknowingly followed lines first drawn to move logs out of the mountains. Meanwhile, climate conversations added new urgency to forest preservation. Scientists emphasized the role of mature forests in carbon storage and temperature regulation. Areas once stripped bare were now recognized as valuable carbon sinks. The idea that trees could serve not just as timber, but as essential climate regulators, reflected a profound shift in perspective from the early 20th century. In local communities, heritage tourism slowly grew. Former industrial rail grades were converted into walking and cycling trails. Interpretive markers describe how steam locomotives once hauled massive logs through the same valleys now filled with hikers and birdwatchers. School groups visited restored depots and small museums displaying crosscut saws taller than the children standing beside them. Emily eventually became part of a regional conservation initiative that partnered with landowners to protect mature forest stands from future overharvesting. The work required diplomacy as much as science. Many families depended on timber income, just as earlier generations had. The difference now was the emphasis on sustainable yield, harvesting in cycles designed to preserve long-term forest health rather than clear-cutting entire slopes. During one outreach meeting in a small town hall, an elderly woman stood up and spoke about her father, who had worked in a logging camp similar to Red Ash. She described how he came home each evening covered in sawdust, exhausted but grateful to have earned enough to feed his family during difficult times. "We can't judge them by what we know now," she said gently. "They did what they had to do." Her words settled heavily in the room. They captured the central truth of the story. The past was shaped by circumstance. The present was shaped by reflection. On another visit to the old campsite, Emily noticed something new. A large oak tree, easily 80 years old, had fallen during a storm. Its exposed root system revealed layers of soil and fragments of rusted metal embedded deep below. A spike from a rail line protruded from the earth, preserved by time. The tree had grown around it for decades, absorbing it into its foundation before finally toppling. It was a powerful image, nature and industry intertwined, inseparable even in decay. Standing there, she realized that recovery does not mean erasure. The forest had not erased the logging era. It had grown through it. The land carried both damage and renewal simultaneously. Interpretive markers describe how steam locomotives once hauled massive logs through the same valleys now filled with hikers and birdwatchers. School groups visited restored depots and small museums displaying crosscut saws taller than the children standing beside them. Emily eventually became part of a regional conservation initiative that partnered with landowners to protect mature forest stands from future overharvesting. The work required diplomacy as much as science. Many families depended on timber income, just as earlier generations had. The difference now was the emphasis on sustainable yield, harvesting in cycles designed to preserve long-term forest health rather than clear-cutting entire slopes. During one outreach meeting in a small town hall, an elderly woman stood up and spoke about her father, who had worked in a logging camp similar to Red Ash. She described how he came home each evening covered in sawdust, exhausted but grateful to have earned enough to feed his family during difficult times. "We can't judge them by what we know now," she said gently. "They did what they had to do." Her words settled heavily in the room. They captured the central truth of the story. The past was shaped by circumstance. The present was shaped by reflection. On another visit to the old campsite, Emily noticed something new. A large oak tree, easily 80 years old, had fallen during a storm. Its exposed root system revealed layers of soil and fragments of rusted metal embedded deep below. A spike from a rail line protruded from the earth, preserved by time. The tree had grown around it for decades, absorbing it into its foundation before finally toppling. It was a powerful image, nature and industry intertwined, inseparable even in decay. Standing there, she realized that recovery does not mean erasure. The forest had not erased the logging era. It had grown through it. The land carried both damage and renewal simultaneously. That layered reality mirrored human history itself. As the region moved further into the 21st century, younger generations approached the mountains with different ambitions. Some pursued careers in renewable energy, environmental law, sustainable agriculture, or ecotourism. Others returned after time in cities, seeking quieter lives rooted in place. Broadband internet and improved infrastructure allowed remote work, reducing dependence on single-resource industries. While economic challenges persisted, diversification offered resilience that earlier generations lacked. Yet even amid progress, reminders of vulnerability remained. Severe storms occasionally triggered landslides in areas once heavily cut. Scientists noted that forests recovering from past disturbances sometimes responded differently to extreme weather. The lessons of the early logging era continue to inform disaster preparedness and land management decisions. In quiet cemeteries scattered across the hills, weathered stones marked the resting places of men like Thomas Hale and Carlo. Some graves bore clear names, others had only initials. Community historians worked to document these burial grounds before time erased inscriptions entirely. Their efforts ensured that the human cost of industrial expansion would not be forgotten. One autumn evening, as golden light spread across the valley, Emily brought her own young son to the ridge. She told him about his great-great-grandfather who once worked there. She explained how the trees had been cut, how the land had struggled, and how it had grown back. The boy listened, eyes wide, trying to imagine a forest without trees. "Will they cut it down again?" he asked. "Not like before," she answered carefully. "We know more now." Her response carried both hope and responsibility. Knowledge alone does not guarantee protection, but it changes the choices available. The mountains stood in layered shades of blue, fading into the horizon just as they had for centuries. Wind moved through leaves, creating a steady whisper that seemed almost like breath. In that sound was continuity, past and present connected by growth, memory, and adaptation. The story that began with axes and steam engines did not end with abandonment. It evolved into a narrative of learning. Red Ash Camp had risen quickly and vanished just as fast, leaving scars and livelihoods intertwined. From those scars grew forests once more, along with awareness that abundance is not infinite. The final measure of that history is not found in the number of trees cut or railcars filled, but in the recognition that progress without balance carries cost. Appalachia's forests today stand as living archives, each ring in each trunk marking seasons that followed disruption, drought, storm, and renewal. Long after the last logger left the hollow, the land continued its patient work of healing. Generations came and went, industries shifted, and understanding deepened. The mountains endured, not unchanged, but unbroken, holding within their ridges the memory of labor and the promise of stewardship. And so the story continues still, written not in headlines or company ledgers, but in the quiet upward reach of trees reclaiming the sky, in families who remember, and in the ongoing choice to walk more carefully through the forests that once seemed endless. Even after everything had been studied, documented, and discussed, the mountains remained quieter than the history they carried. Time softened sharp edges, but it never erased them completely. The ridges that once shook with the crash of falling timber now absorbed sound gently, as if guarding what they had witnessed. In the early 2010s, interest in regional history deepened as digital storytelling platforms gave small communities a larger voice. Local archivists began scanning fragile photographs from the early 1900s, images of logging crews standing beside enormous chestnut trunks, steam engines billowing smoke into the sky, temporary wooden bridges stretching across narrow ravines. These images circulated online, reaching descendants scattered across the country. Families who had moved away decades earlier saw, sometimes for the first time, the environments their ancestors had worked in. Among the recovered materials were accident ledgers from several Appalachian timber operations. The entries were brief and clinical: name, date, cause. Struck by falling limb. Crushed under rolling log. Cable failure. Each line represented a life interrupted. The simplicity of the records made them heavier. There were no long descriptions, no dramatic language, just evidence of how routine danger had become. At the same time, forestry professionals used the region as a living classroom. University students conducted field studies comparing untouched forest pockets with areas known to have been clear-cut in the early 20th century. Soil cores revealed differences in nutrient layers. Tree diversity varied depending on past land use. Even wildlife patterns reflected earlier disturbance. History, it turned out, lingered beneath the surface far longer than visible scars. Yet something else persisted too: resilience. On slopes once stripped bare, hardwood forests now stood thick enough to block out midday sun. Some trees had reached diameters that surprised researchers, proof of how quickly certain species can recover under the right conditions. Streams that had once run muddy stabilized over time as root systems anchored the soil. Beaver populations returned in some valleys, creating wetlands that supported birds and amphibians. For many residents, the narrative shifted from loss to balance. They no longer viewed the past solely as damage done, but as a lesson learned. Timber harvesting did not disappear entirely. It evolved. Selective cutting replaced widespread clear-cutting in many managed forests. Certification systems encouraged responsible forestry practices. Landowners began considering long-term planning rather than immediate gain. Still, every so often, heavy machinery could be heard in distant hollows where modern logging operations worked under stricter guidelines. The sound carried differently than the chaotic roar of early steam skidders, but it echoed enough to remind older generations of earlier times. Progress, even when more careful, remained a negotiation between use and preservation. Emily, now deeply involved in conservation policy, often reflected on how her great-grandfather had once believed the forest endless. That belief had not been foolish. It had been shaped by perspective. When surrounded by mountains covered in timber as far as the eye could see, scarcity seemed unimaginable. What changed over time was not only the forest, but awareness. During a community forum about sustainable land management, she shared a simple image, a photograph from 1910 showing a hillside reduced to stumps, placed beside a present-day photograph of the same ridge covered in green. The contrast spoke louder than statistics. Recovery was possible, but it required patience measured in decades, even generations. After the presentation, a young man approached her. He worked in modern forestry and worried that his profession was still misunderstood. "We are not doing what they did back then," he said. "We plan. We rotate. We replant." She nodded. That's the difference. They didn't think they had to. The conversation reminded her that history should guide, not condemn. The men of Red Ash Camp and countless other settlements had operated within the knowledge and economic systems of their time. Today's responsibility was to build on that experience, not repeat it blindly. As seasons continued to cycle through the Appalachian Hills, the mountains held steady. Snow layered over branches in winter, insulating roots below. Spring rains nourished undergrowth. Summer storms rolled across ridgelines, lightning flashing briefly against dense canopies. Autumn returned each year in a blaze of color that drew visitors from far beyond the region. Hikers walking along converted rail trails sometimes paused at interpretive signs describing early logging. They read about steam-powered skidders and crosscut saws, about company scrip and bunkhouses. Many were surprised to learn how dramatically the land had once been altered. Standing there amid thick woods, it was difficult to imagine hills stripped nearly clean. And perhaps that was the most powerful testament of all, not that the damage had occurred, but that recovery had reshaped the view so completely. Late one evening, as dusk settled once more over the ridge where Reddish Camp had stood, wind moved steadily through the leaves. It carried no sound of whistles or falling timber now, only the steady murmur of a living forest. The ground beneath the trees still held fragments of iron and forgotten tools, quiet witnesses beneath roots and stone. The story that began with need and ambition had stretched across more than a century. It had passed through hardship, growth, decline, reflection, and renewal. It had moved from axes to archives, from steam engines to satellites. Each generation added its own chapter. The mountains remained, not untouched, but enduring. And in their endurance lies the truest continuation of all, a reminder that land and people shape one another over time. What is taken leaves a mark. What is learned leaves direction. What is cared for leaves hope. The forest stands again over the hollow once filled with noise, rising patiently toward the sky, no longer seen as endless, but understood as precious. As the years moved forward, the forest did what it had always done. It kept growing quietly, without announcement or celebration. Rings formed inside trunks, one thin circle at a time, marking summers of rain and winters of frost. Each ring carried a memory of conditions faced and endured. In a way, the trees were historians too. By the 2020s, conversations about land stewardship reached a new intensity. Climate change, wildfires in other regions, and global deforestation brought renewed focus to forests everywhere. Appalachia, once stripped aggressively for timber, now stood as an example of large-scale natural regrowth. Scientists studying reforestation often cited the region as proof that damaged ecosystems can recover when left protected for long enough. Yet recovery did not mean perfection. Invasive species like the emerald ash borer and hemlock woolly adelgid threatened certain native trees. Warmer temperatures altered seasonal patterns. Conservation became not just about protecting what had grown back, but defending it from new dangers. Emily found herself working on long-term forest monitoring projects. Teams placed small, discrete markers in remote plots to measure tree growth, soil moisture, and species diversity. Data was collected year after year. Unlike the logging era, which focused on rapid extraction, modern forestry science focused on patience. One afternoon, while checking a monitoring site near the old Red Ash Hollow, Emily paused beside a tall tulip poplar. Based on its diameter, it had likely begun growing around 1925, just after the original camp was abandoned. That meant it had stood for nearly a century, its roots spreading through soil once churned by skidders and mule teams. It was a child of disturbance, yet now it towered confidently above the landscape. She imagined Thomas Hale walking past the first saplings pushing through mud after the clear-cutting ended. He could not have known that those thin shoots would one day grow into a forest capable of shading the entire valley again. Renewal often begins invisibly, too small to notice. Local schools continued organizing field trips to teach students about both industrial history and ecological recovery. Teachers encouraged children to think critically about resource use. Timber remained an important material, renewable when managed responsibly. The key difference lay in balance. During one such field visit, a student asked why the early companies had not replanted trees after cutting them down. The guide explained that replanting was not common practice at the time. Many companies moved on once profits declined, leaving regeneration to happen naturally. It was a short-term business model built on the assumption of limitless land. The children seemed surprised. For them, planting trees after harvesting seemed obvious. That shift in thinking reflected generational progress. What once felt unnecessary now felt essential. Meanwhile, Appalachian communities continued redefining themselves. Art, music, storytelling, and regional literature increasingly highlighted the layered complexity of mountain history. Logging camps and coal towns appeared not only as symbols of hardship, but as chapters of endurance. Writers and filmmakers explored the tension between survival and sustainability, drawing from documented events rather than myth. At a regional heritage festival, descendants of logging families gathered to share stories. Some brought heirlooms, axes passed down through generations, metal script tokens, faded pay stubs. Others brought photographs enlarged from fragile originals. There was laughter alongside reflection. The past was no longer raw. It had become a shared narrative. An elderly man at the festival summarized it simply: "The mountains taught us. Sometimes the hard way." As evening settled, blue mist drifted through the valleys just as it had a century earlier. The ridgelines laid themselves into the distance, unchanged in shape though changed in story. Beneath the forest floor, fragments of iron rested beside roots that had grown around them. Above, leaves caught the fading light. The Red Ash Hollow no longer carried the noise of sawmills. It carried wind, birdsong, and the steady hum of insects in summer. What had once been temporary structures of wood and tin were gone, replaced by living timber rooted deeply in soil that had healed itself over decades. And still, the story did not end. Every generation walking those trails adds another layer, another interpretation of what the mountains mean. Some see economic opportunity. Some see ecological responsibility. Most see both, intertwined. The lesson carried forward is not that industry is inherently destructive, nor that preservation requires abandonment of progress. It is that decisions echo across time. If Thomas Hale could stand on that ridge today, he would likely be astonished by how tall the forest has grown again. He might not recognize the species distribution or understand satellite mapping, but he would recognize the wind through leaves. He would understand the feeling of standing small beneath towering trees. The mountains have outlived every company that tried to claim them. They have absorbed ambition, loss, recovery, and reflection. They remain patient. In the quiet of the present forest, where green canopies stretch across valleys once scarred by stumps, the continuation of the story is written not in destruction but in growth. It lives in careful planning, in protected land, in children who plant seedlings knowing they may never sit in their shade. The hollow that once echoed with axes now whispers with leaves. And as long as trees continue to rise toward the Appalachian sky, the story of red ash, of labor, consequence, and renewal, continues with them. In recent years, the hollow has become part of a quiet research corridor stretching across several Appalachian counties. Conservation groups partnered with universities to connect patches of forest into continuous wildlife pathways, allowing black bears, bobcats, and migratory birds to move freely without crossing major highways. What had once been fragmented by logging rail lines was slowly being reconnected with deliberate planning. Old aerial photographs from the 1930s were overlaid with modern drone images. The comparison was striking. Where the earlier photographs showed pale, scarred hillsides with scattered stumps and exposed earth. The modern images displayed deep green ridges and layered canopy. The land had not simply returned, it had adapted. Yet adaptation brought its own complexity. Forest density in some areas had increased beyond natural historical levels because fire suppression policies prevented the smaller, periodic burns that once cleared underbrush. Ecologists began reintroducing controlled burns to restore balance. It was another lesson drawn from history. Interference without understanding can create new problems, even when intentions are protective. Emily often reflected on how the early loggers worked with muscle, steam, and immediate need. Today's foresters worked with data, satellite models, and climate projections. But at the core, the relationship between people and land remained constant. The difference lay in foresight. During a late summer survey, she and her team followed a creek that once ran brown from erosion during the clear-cut years. Now the water flowed clear over smooth stones. Salamanders darted beneath submerged leaves. The return of such sensitive species indicated long-term improvement in water quality. It was evidence not just of regrowth, but of ecological stabilization. Nearby, an interpretive plaque had recently been installed along a public trail. It described the rise and fall of early 20th century logging camps in the region, including settlements like Red Ash. It did not dramatize. It presented facts, dates of operation, estimated timber output, population numbers, documented injuries, and eventual abandonment. Visitors often lingered longer at this sign than others. The tangible contrast between the peaceful forest around them and the intense industrial activity described on the plaque created a powerful awareness. Some visitors left with admiration for the resilience of nature. Others left with questions about modern consumption. How many forests elsewhere were currently facing similar pressure? The hollow had become both memorial and lesson. As renewable energy projects began expanding in parts of Appalachia, debates emerged about land use once again. Wind turbines on ridges, solar arrays in valleys. Each proposal carried benefits and trade-offs. Community meetings echoed with familiar themes: economic opportunity, environmental protection, long-term vision. Though the industries differed from timber and coal, the central question remained unchanged: how to use the land without exhausting it. Emily, now a respected voice in regional conservation, often reminded audiences that the story of the mountains was not a simple arc from destruction to redemption. It was cyclical and ongoing. Decisions made today would shape landscapes decades from now. Just as Thomas and his generation could not see the full impact of their work, modern society must act with humility. On an unusually warm autumn evening, she returned once more to the ridge above Reddish Hollow. The air carried the scent of fallen leaves and distant wood smoke from a farmhouse chimney. As twilight settled, the forest shifted into its night rhythm, owls beginning to call, insects softening their daytime chorus. She stood where the main mill building had likely been positioned over a century earlier. Nothing visible remained of it now. No foundation stones, no beams. Only trees. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the soundscape of 1912. Steam engines hissing, logs slamming onto skids, shouted warnings before a tree fell. It must have felt relentless. Opening her eyes, she saw only layered branches swaying gently. The contrast was almost surreal. It occurred to her that the mountains do not hold grudges. They respond to what is done to them, but they do not cling to anger. Given time and care, they rebuild. That quiet resilience carries a warning and a comfort at the same time. Far below, the creek traced the same path it had carved for centuries. Water moved steadily, indifferent to eras of industry or reform. The sky above shifted from gold to deep blue, stars emerging slowly between branches. The story of Red Ash had stretched far beyond its original decade of operation. It had touched economics, ecology, family memory, and public policy. It had evolved from immediate survival to reflective stewardship. And still, it was not finished. In another 100 years, the forest standing there now will look different again. Some trees will fall naturally, creating gaps for new growth. Climate patterns may reshape species distribution. Communities will continue adapting, guided by knowledge inherited from past mistakes and successes alike. But one truth remains constant: the land records everything. In rings of wood, in layers of soil, in the alignment of tree stands along forgotten railbeds, the memory persists. Not as haunting echoes, but as quiet evidence. Those who choose to look closely can read it. As darkness settled fully over the hollow, wind moved through the canopy in a steady whisper, no longer the roar of industry, but the sound of continuity. The mountains stood as they always have, altered yet enduring, shaped by human hands and healing through time. She stood where the main mill building had likely been positioned over a century earlier. Nothing visible remained of it now. No foundation stones, no beams. Only trees. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine the soundscape of 1912. Steam engines hissing, logs slamming onto skids, shouted warnings before a tree fell. It must have felt relentless. Opening her eyes, she saw only layered branches swaying gently. The contrast was almost surreal. It occurred to her that the mountains do not hold grudges. They respond to what is done to them, but they do not cling to anger. Given time and care, they rebuild. That quiet resilience carries a warning and a comfort at the same time. Far below, the creek traced the same path it had carved for centuries. Water moved steadily, indifferent to eras of industry or reform. The sky above shifted from gold to deep blue, stars emerging slowly between branches. The story of red ash had stretched far beyond its original decade of operation. It had touched economics, ecology, family memory, and public policy. It had evolved from immediate survival to reflective stewardship. And still, it was not finished. In another 100 years, the forest standing there now will look different again. Some trees will fall naturally, creating gaps for new growth. Climate patterns may reshape species distribution. Communities will continue adapting, guided by knowledge inherited from past mistakes and successes alike. But one truth remains constant: the land records everything. In rings of wood, in layers of soil, in the alignment of tree stands along forgotten railbeds, the memory persists. Not as haunting echoes, but as quiet evidence. Those who choose to look closely can read it. As darkness settled fully over the hollow, wind moved through the canopy in a steady whisper, no longer the roar of industry, but the sound of continuity. The mountains stood as they always have, altered yet enduring, shaped by human hands and healing through time. Winter returned to the mountains the way it always had, quietly at first, with a thin silver frost along the ridges, then more firmly with long nights and frozen ground. Snow settled into the hollow, softening every contour. Underneath that white stillness lay more than a century of layered history, stumps long rotted into soil, iron slowly surrendering to rust, seeds pushing roots deeper each year. In the cold clarity of January, the forest revealed shapes normally hidden by leaves. Old roadbeds from the logging era became faint but visible lines cutting across slopes. Shallow depressions marked where water once pooled around steam engines. To someone who knew how to read the land, the past never fully disappeared, it only changed form. Emily often said that landscapes are like living archives. They do not speak in words, but in patterns. In the hollow of red ash, the pattern told a story of rapid extraction followed by patient return. It told of human urgency and natural persistence. By now, younger conservationists had joined the work. Many were born long after coal's decline and had no personal memory of large-scale logging. To them, the mountains were primarily spaces of recreation and biodiversity. Yet through research and storytelling, they learned that what felt timeless was actually restored. One spring, a severe storm swept through the region, knocking down several large trees near the old campsite. When the cleanup crew arrived weeks later, they discovered something unexpected beneath an uprooted oak, a cluster of hand-forged spikes, likely used to secure rail tracks. The iron was pitted and fragile, but recognizable. The discovery was reported to the local historical society, which carefully collected the artifacts for preservation. The find sparked renewed local interest. Community members organized a small exhibit titled Beneath the Roots, displaying the recovered spikes alongside photographs of early logging camps. The exhibit emphasized continuity, the idea that the forest growing today stands literally on the remains of yesterday's industry. Visitors often lingered before a photograph taken around 1910. In it, men posed beside a towering stump, their faces serious, clothing dusted with sawdust. Behind them stretched a barren hillside. It was not an image of villains or heroes. It was an image of workers in their time, shaped by necessity. Children viewing the exhibit sometimes asked why the hillside had been left empty. The answer, again, was simple. No one had planned beyond immediate profit. Replanting and sustainability were not yet standard practice. The concept of ecological balance had not taken root in public consciousness. In the present, however, balance became central to policy discussions. Land trusts expanded their holdings to protect vulnerable tracts from development. Reforestation programs extended into former mining areas, applying lessons learned from earlier logging damage. Universities partnered with local governments to monitor long-term forest health. The hollow itself gradually became part of a protected conservation area. Trails were maintained carefully to minimize erosion. Signage encouraged visitors to stay on marked paths to protect young growth. What had once been exploited quickly was now managed deliberately. On a bright summer morning years later, Emily returned again, this time not as a researcher, but simply as a visitor. She walked slowly, no clipboard in hand, listening. The air hummed with cicadas. Sunlight filtered through leaves in shifting patterns. The forest felt alive in a way that photographs from 1912 could never have imagined. She paused beside a stream bend where sediment deposits once choked the water after clear-cutting. Now the banks were stable, lined with ferns and wildflowers. Dragonflies hovered above the surface. The system, though altered, had found equilibrium. Sitting on a fallen log, she reflected on how long it had taken. Nearly a century for the forest to regain this density. Decades of policy shifts and community effort. Generations carrying forward stories of what happened when urgency outweighed foresight. The mountains do not rush. They measure time differently. Far away, cities built with Appalachian timber continued to stand. Houses framed by wood cut from slopes like these, railroad ties once laid across expanding rail networks. The labor of Red Ash Camp had traveled far beyond its hollow. In that sense, the men who worked there helped shape landscapes they would never see. And yet, their own landscape endured beyond them. Even now, subtle reminders remain. A slightly straighter row of trees where tracks once ran, an unusual clearing pattern where the mill yard stood. To most eyes, it is simply forest. To informed ones, it is a layered narrative. As evening approached, shadows lengthened across the ridge. The wind shifted gently, carrying the scent of pine and damp earth. Emily stood and began walking back toward the trailhead. She felt neither sorrow nor triumph, only a quiet respect. The continuation of Red Ash is not dramatic. It is steady. It unfolds in tree growth charts and family stories, in preserved artifacts and new seedlings planted each spring. It exists in policy debates and children's questions. It lives in the awareness that progress must consider consequence. The hollow, once loud with saws and steam, now speaks in subtler tones. Leaves rustle. Water moves. Birds call across distances that no longer echo with machinery. The mountains remain, altered yet enduring, reminding each generation that what is taken leaves a trace, and what is nurtured leaves a legacy. And as long as the forest continues to rise, rooted in soil shaped by both damage and healing, the story continues, written quietly in wood and wind.